Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to really think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Christopher Such.
Hello again.
Neil Almond.
Hello.
And Lloyd Williams-Jones.
Hello.
And together, we'll try and answer the question, how do you solve a problem like confidence-weighted multiple choice questions? But first, I'd like to take a second to tell you about the Discord server that we've set up for those of you who listen to the podcast. A link can be found as part of the show description, and really it's a place for members of the Tadabe family to chat about all things that we hold dear, as well as supporting each other in our continued professional development. Links have a 7-day limit, but I'll share them regularly under episodes and over at thinkingdeeply.info. So Lloyd, what are confidence-weighted multiple choice questions?
Okay, so confidence-weighted multiple choice questions are a pedagogical device, I would say, that teachers can deploy as a check for understanding. It's a really useful tool to be able to very quickly, efficiently assess what understanding is going on in your room, and also potentially what misconceptions are present in the room. And I'm not going to go into the details because I'm sure we'll unpack it as we go along, but I would say on the whole, that's what they do.
And I think most people listening will be pretty familiar with multiple choice questions. What's the difference between a confidence-weighted multiple choice question and a regular multiple choice question?
Yeah, that's a good point. So where we normally would have a multiple choice question with some really strong distractors that are there to probe that thinking or pick up on misconceptions. The confidence-weighted element is tapping into the metacognitive process of answering questions, getting children to engage somewhat with the self-reporting element to answering questions. So thinking about thinking and where they are with their understanding of the particular question or thing that's being assessed. So they would then give some sort of rating, some sort of gauge on how confident they are that they are right or that they are wrong, and as we'll go into, everything in between. But again, it depends on the structure of the confidence-weighted question that you deploy. So this is probably something that I haven't seen a lot written about it. I know Harry Fletcher-Wood does a lot of work around multiple choice questions being hinge questions, important questions from the work of William. But in terms of the confidence rated stuff, I know Colin Foster has been involved in the development of some research around this, but it's a fascinating area. So I'm really looking forward to discussing today about some of the potential gains and maybe pitfalls of rolling it out.
Nice, very well put, Lloyd. Does anyone else want to jump in on what they are? Because I know that we're trying to describe, I will definitely put a picture of what I imagine a confidence-weighted multiple choice question to look like at about 9:03 on Saturday morning. But I also, is there anything else anyone would add in terms of what they are?
Can I clarify then? I'd be right in thinking that confidence-weighted multiple choice questions are something slightly different to the idea of having a mere multiple choice question and then assigning a confidence rating to your answer. There's something specific in how you might score an answer, for example, that makes them slightly different to a mere multiple choice question with an attached element of confidence. Would I be right in thinking that?
Yeah, so there's an important point to make, that there's that underlying relationship between answers that is exposed via the weighted element, and I think that is an important thing to focus on when we get into discussion that we pick up, as we will. pick up on that side of it, because that is the element, that sort of dynamic, that mechanism within the question that shifts it again. So I guess we can look at it, like you said, in three dimensions. The first one, multiple choice questions, then multiple choice questions with some sort of self-reporting, then multiple choice questions that have a weighting that then affects a relationship or a dynamic between your answers. And I think, yeah, it's important. It definitely, Chris, that's important to point out.
So a key aspect of how these questions are set up, you'd say, is the fact that you can, in a sense, hedge your bets in certain circumstances and say, actually, I think it's one of these two options, possibly more this one than this one. And then the kind of score, as it were, that you will get from that will depend on, how the extent to which you hedged your bets, and of course, the extent to which you got it right. That's, as you can tell from me asking questions rather than giving definitive statements on this, this is not an area that I'm particularly conversant with. I'm in the conversation to hopefully ask some provocative questions.
I think, it's been a while since I read any of the papers, but that was one of the studies, wasn't it, where they had multiple choice questions on their own, multiple choice questions, and then a separate report on confidence, and then the confidence weighted multiple choice questions that we use, where it's essentially a triangle where each of the vertices is one of the answers. And in the study, or in the studies that have taken place, you have various points on each of the sides, and how far away you are from an answer indicates how certain you are that that answer is the correct answer. And that's the way we use them in school. You've essentially got a triangle with three possible answers, and pupils, if they select right on an answer on one of the vertices, then they're 100% certain this is the right answer. And if they go in between, then they are suggesting they're not 100% certain.
Standards like that, they'd normally be in the center of the triangle, just a don't know answer. So if children were really had no idea, there was the option to show that is your answer that you just didn't know. But then interestingly, I'm sure we'll discuss this a bit later on, in another paper that I found, they discussed the merits of whether actually if that's a good thing to have, because if a child looks at the question and then sees that don't know box, then immediately they don't think that they know it, they'll just go to the safety of the don't know. Whereas actually, before they actually try and search their schema for what they think might be a plausible answer, they just skip to that don't know, and that then kind of switches them off. I mean, from my understanding, why they came about was, and Lloyd touched on this, the metacognitive process that this provides versus a standard multiple choice. So what they've found, I believe what they were trying to demonstrate, was that you're more likely to think why something is not the right answer, thus retrieving more information from your schema on whatever the subject is. And so by doing that, you're obviously boosting learning, having to think whether, I think it might be that one, I think it might be that one. So there's just that ever so slightly deeper schema search compared to the confidence weighted multiple choice to your standard. I think it was the work by Little in 2011 who found that only about 30% of regular multiple choice test takers would engage in a strategy of like, well, I know it's not this one because I know it's not this one because, so therefore it must be that one. Whereas 70% would just say, well, I either know it or I don't. And it's that added benefit of that kind of metacognitive, well, it's not this one because, is what the researchers hypothesize is the added bonus that you get from using confidence weighted multiple choice questions as described by Kieran, where you have a triangle and at each corner, each vertices, there is a possible answer, and then there's various dots around the triangle to let you know how confident you feel in each answer.
Yeah, and it was interesting that I think a paper thing that you suggested to me, either Kieran or Neil, Spark, Bjork and Bjork, 2016, which is my only engagement with this subject on a research level at all. it talked about, as you were saying earlier, this difference between saying, here's the question with a separate with a separate confidence weighting. Here's the question where it's built in this scored sense. And from this, you can see that it isn't just the confidence rating. It isn't purely that element of that metacognitive element that is effective. It's like you say, Neil, it's this idea of saying, no, you have to compare the options and start to look in why a given option isn't the right idea. With my year 6 teacher hat on, I immediately think of those old SATs questions where there'd be a multiple choice question of some form in like a grammar paper, for example. And you'd look at it and think, well, I know that you don't know the right answer, but if you just look at the wrong answers, I promise you'll get there.
Exactly.
Yep. And I wonder if there's like an extra like hidden benefit to these confidence weighted multiple choice questions and the way that they make children or participants, because the research has mainly been on undergraduates, but the way that they make participants engage with the wrong answers that might have benefits in that cynical sense. The other thing to mention, obviously, about the idea of confidence weighting, I remember seeing the triangle structure and thinking, oh, okay, this is only going to work with 3 answers, isn't it? Because as soon as you've got 4, unless you've got some kind of 3-dimensional model, some kind of, I guess it'd be a tetrahedron. Unless you've got a tetrahedron there, you can't have 4 connected points and pick a place in between all of them. If you represented it with a square, for example, with 4 answers, you can't have it exactly in the same way. So it does restrict you, I presume, to just 3 answers, which when in the few occasions where I've done multiple choice stuff, I've always gone for 4, and I don't know why, other than maybe I've watched Who Wants to Be a Millionaire too much.
I don't know if we discussed on a really early episode, but I always find the 4th answer, a lot of multiple choice questions seems to be a stretch. You know, it seems to be there because the format has 4. I quite like having 3 because I think a lot of content lends itself to an overgeneralization in 2 directions and then the right answer. And that's what I really like about having the 3. And even when I've designed 4 possible answers in the past myself, I find, sometimes I'm reaching for that 4th one. So I think this isn't something we're going to use all the time. We'll get into, how do we get the most out of them. I think a nice balance, is offered. So I wouldn't worry too much. Thinking about the don't know, that point really stood out to me, that they weren't sure where to go to next. And I think our teachers have taken that out. So we've been using them this last year across the school. And I don't think they don't know in the middle. They don't give the pupils the option, because I think they've decided that they know that there's a critical mass who will go for that when they want to take the path of least resistance. And that's not what it's about. It's like you say, Lloyd, it's about getting kids to think even further and more deeply about the content that they're sort of presented with.
Yeah, the way that the multiple choice triangle is set up seems to be intentionally strongly punitive of wrong answers. So actually a decent strategy for doing okay would just be saying don't know every time and ending up with a respectable score of 0. So I wonder that ties into what you're saying there, Kieran.
It's really interesting. I was thinking about, before we started talking about this, about that actually, and the idea, that whole idea of metacognition, that whole idea of self-reporting and gaming and strategizing. I know William has talked about this in the past, about children will game things wherever they possibly can, right? And you can just see those. I can see those year 6 kids who go, if I go in the middle every time, or like if I don't go for hard and fast answers every time, I'm going to be all right. I'm going to just skate along, getting some points. If I roughly know, if they can use that strategy of going between 2 answers, they might know, all right, it's not going to work every time. But kids will do that, right? They will do that. And I guess we're getting on to, I don't know, we've already diverged a little bit into deep meta stuff already. But I think it's important to consider, because, but add it with an added caveat of what you said, Kieran, it's about sensible use, isn't it? It's about when you deploy these, how much you deploy these is vital. Like if you're doing these all the time, I would hazard a guess they might not work. It's about being strategic, about being measured in how much that you do, and create. I go back to, I know I mention them all the time, but like talking about PEPs and talking about what he talks about motivation and about their ability to, ego checking and things like that. That all comes into play when we come into these sorts of questions, because they don't want, and I hear Harry Fletcher Wood talking about this, how you what do you do to combat copying in this situation? Because that's the thing that will erode the validity of this, is copying, isn't it? So how do we set up culture where we reduce that, routines and norms and things that we can nudge in the class to stop that happening? I think there's a whole thing, a raft of things we can do there, with our, heads being down, reveal times, all these sorts of things that combat that ego thing, because that peer, as I know Chris has mentioned in previous episodes, that thing of, I want to fit in with the norms here, like, and I don't want to be like, Bob's got it, that I'm going to write what Bob's got, like, otherwise I'll look like an idiot in front of the class. That's not, we want to try and combat that. And it's quite complicated, isn't it? When you start, and I was trying to think about it with, I currently do it in my own practice with sort of the 4-question approach. And interestingly now, having sort of read the research around the impact being nothing on just assigning a confidence rating to it, rather than looking at the relationship between answers, I might have to take a rethink on that, which is good. However, I have already had to put things in place to combat those very things, and on the ground level, when you're delivering it, like I say, it's not with undergrads. We're dealing with 7-year-old, 8-year-old kids, and there's there'll be a different feel to that. So I think it's worth us exploring that potential. I don't know what others think about that.
Thinking about ego again, like you said, this comes back to the idea of the quality of the distractors, because you're talking about how it's easier to come up with really quality distractors if you've just got 3 answers to choose from. Well, if you've got really good quality distractors, I imagine that takes some of the pressure off anyway, because if a child gets something wrong, you can honestly and openly say, well, I totally understand why you went for that answer, because that links to something else we've talked about. There is a misconception there, but it's not right, but it was a sensible guess because of other things we've learned about it. And this is why. Whereas if perhaps you've got 4, 5, etc., if you've got more answers and it's harder to come up with distractors, there's this perhaps tendency to say, oh, I'll just chuck in one more answer that actually in retrospect is a bit silly. And then if someone goes for that and gets it wrong, they feel a bit silly. So yeah, I guess this idea of ego, like I say, feeds back into the idea of good quality distractors in the multiple choice questions. So you guys have done a really good job of outlining them, for me at least, and I hope for the audience as well. Why are confidence weighted multiple choice questions particularly useful in the classroom, or why might they be?
I think, Chris, it's kind of something that you touched on ever so slightly earlier when you going back to the idea of kids sitting there, the grammar paper, and being like, I know you don't know the right one, but if you work out which ones it isn't, then you'll work out the actual answer for it. And so we actually want children to realize that is an appropriate strategy at the whilst doing the SATs tests. Absolutely, obviously we don't using these for children to get better at the SATs test, but it's the thinking processes that actually happen to students by going through that process is what we want to encourage in the classroom. And as I kind of said earlier, in one bit of research, only about 30% of, and I think it was done on adults, that particular piece of research, only 30% of adults actually go through that metacognitive process of thinking about this is right or this is wrong because. And so and I think they're quite clear in that Bjork paper, they're quite clear in saying the reason we've designed these multiple choice questions is not to say goodbye to the standard multiple choice format, but actually it's just a way of encouraging children and seeing them, all right, this is actually something that I can do. So I think something that can be done kind of short term. It doesn't have to, we're not certainly not saying throw all those multiple choice questions that you may have written for a scheme of work and reorganize them in this fancy triangle, but you might actually want to consider putting maybe organizing maybe the second or third sets of questions that you choose to give in that format, then maybe the fifth and sixth sets of questions in that format, just so that you're starting to get children to think and realize that there is that metacognitive thought processing that can happen whilst they're doing standard test multiple choice formats. And it is a good strategy to use, say, for long-term learning, because by going through that process, it's going to, they're recalling information from, it is the definition of retrieval practice. They are recalling information from long-term memory. They're using it in their working memory, and they're either deciding, yeah, that's useful, or that's not useful. So I think that's the reason why we, these can be used in the classroom. I do think it's fair to say the research on these is pretty thin, in that there aren't very many studies that look at these, and the studies that do look at them focus particularly on college graduates, and the studies that I've seen particularly look at comprehension and vocabulary. So obviously we can't say that there's massive amount of evidence for these in terms of across different subjects, across different age groups, but obviously I don't think we are saying that this is something you have to do it, but it's certainly something that I think is worth investigating. And I should say, I know Kieran's had great success in bringing these to his teachers, and I'd like to think at some point in this episode we'll hear how his teachers got on with that. But certainly, again, summing up, we're using them to make children realize that there is that metacognitive process that they can get through to find the answer. However, by going through that process, we're actually enhancing learning in other ways that isn't directly represented just by that particular test.
Those people who have used confidence-weighted multiple choice questions in the classroom, would you say that there is any sense in which the gentle jeopardy of these kinds of questions is engaging, fun? I'm always wary of using both of those words because it is so difficult to predict what children find engaging or fun. But is there a sense of that in using them? Have you found that it brings a sense of tension in a welcome sense to the process of asking questions?
So I think one of the things I find this year is that those children who quite often grasp things really quickly, they engage with this kind of question on a really sort of deep level. Certainly when they're shown, and we'll get into how to get the most of them soon, but certainly when they have an understanding of how to approach this kind of question, they come to me and they find me and they tell me that they've worked out the link. Why has the teacher chosen these answers? And then they've gone, I've got it. So they're not spending their time thinking about the actual the answer. They're trying to work out why the teacher has chosen the distractors, and they love that. They can, like I say, they find me in the playground, or the next time I'm in their class, they'll say to me, oh yeah, you chose this question or you chose this response because of that. And yeah, so I do think there is a level of engagement the pupils can get out of it. If you are engaging with the maths on a superficial level, if you're treading water and you're just about getting there, you'll probably get less in terms of engagement and really, really enjoying that kind of problem being posed. But I do think it's an option, and I've certainly experienced that this year with some students coming to mind immediately in terms of conversations we've had, because they're trying to sort of get one up on their teacher. Our teacher thinks they're so clever, they've set me this problem, this is one of the distractors, and now I know. They don't necessarily use the vocabulary, they've chosen this distractor, but they know that this answer has been chosen for a reason, and it's not just three numbers or three responses that they plucked out of thin air.
I think what I can add to that potentially, I have used one or two of these questions with my group when I was teaching, have I mainly more used a confidence rated, not weighted question, if that's what they call. And to just speak with regards to that, Chris, I know it's not a direct comparison, but the gentle jeopardy that you talk about, from my anecdotally, from my experience, has been that they very much engage with it and enjoy it, because it's the gamed element that children enjoy. They enjoy that ability to beat their score, and to, it takes careful management with them comparing. Again, this is back to that ego thing again, isn't it? But you get the right culture, they are encouraged, and we really celebrate when people got past certain milestones of points and things. And I built some reward into that. I know it's an extrinsic factor. Yeah, it did. For me, it leveraged it quite well in my setting, in my context, with my little group of 6 children. But it's an interesting one. It's a really interesting one, because I think what Kieran's describing there is fascinating. That what I've done, it takes it for deeper, and the ability to get into that. You still can talk about distractors, and we still do talk about the links between distractors, because and why misconceptions are there, and spotting. We do that, but obviously it's just far easier leveraged with the structure of the triangle and that setup of the schoolroom. So something that I was sort of thinking about whilst you were talking as well, Kieran, is it, how do we know when is the right time to reveal? So like, when is the right, how long do we hold off the correct answer before revealing? And again, this was something that Harry Fletcher Wood was talking about, is like, when is the right point before we reveal the correct answer? How far into the misconceptions do we go before it becomes too much?
We had that discussion during the feedback episode, and I really like Neil's ideas about perhaps waiting until the afternoon. In terms of misconceptions, I think if they've really overly generalized, you need to hit that head on. The earlier you can address that, the less you're going to have to overwrite, because as we all know, they're not going anywhere. Those misconceptions are just going to be written over again by new information. And so, I think in practice, our retrieval opportunities, which is where these get utilized most, it's very much a case of the pupils take part in the retrieval opportunity, and then there's either some modeling or self-marking that takes place, depending on, the teacher will be surveying the class the whole way through, so they'll be able to get a picture of, is this something I need to give 5 minutes to? Is this something I'm going to have to put into my sequence, or can they just mark it because actually I can see that the vast majority have sort of got this? So I don't think we'll ever find the answer to when the right time to give feedback is. But I totally see what you mean, because if they're struggling and you want them to struggle and you want them to think about it, there's nothing to stop bringing in a similar question the next day. Maybe say, okay, I'm not going to address this right now, but a teacher in the class will get a feel for what's necessary. Chris will know his kids, and he'll sit and say, okay, I know that I need to address this now, because if I don't, this is going to cause me issues down the line. But equally, he'll be able to say, no, I think we can do this, and I'm going to use a similar question tomorrow. And so depends on the expertise of the teacher. But I also think that if you're not experienced and you're not really 100% sure about where your class need to go, trial and error and thinking about what happened is the route to expertise. So I don't have a definite answer, but hopefully that sort of illuminates the sort of approach we take with this.
Yeah, I think there's too much going on between content and different subjects and how those subjects are arranged and organized to really give a massive definitive answer. I mean, for example, if it was mathematics and you really, really needed your children to know this one thing before you move on to the next lesson, because that next lesson actually moves those children on. Obviously, you want to intervene and disrupt that misconception as quick as possible. Whereas a subject that's not hierarchical, you will obviously, there's not that sense of urgency to make sure that you correct that misconception as quickly as something that is more hierarchical. So yeah, it's too many spinning plates on that one, I think, to give any kind of definitive answer. I don't think it's one that research is going to answer anytime soon, or if it does, it's certainly not something you could extrapolate and generalize across other subjects outside that given study.
I'm going to throw a spanner in the works and do the opposite of what you guys have said and probably say something a little bit definitive, which is, if in doubt, however, whether or not you've seen a misconception, whether it's from a confidence-weighted multiple choice question, a regular multiple choice question, or anything else, if in doubt, address that misconception there and then. I think there is, potential avenues for teachers to explore and experiment, as everyone has said, to see how you might delay feedback in order to gain advantages and to make this kind of thing more productive. But to my mind, I reckon if in doubt, address it head on there and then. That's how I would go about things. I can't say I'm basing that on any particular research or anything else other than just my gut feel on what I tend to do as a teacher. I
think it's fair. I'm thinking back to the CPD idea of misconceptions when as our teachers sort of come in and are trained. And the icon I use is the radioactive icon, because you want to obliterate them as much as possible. So I think it's a fair default setting. And then I think as you get more confident in your craft, you can experiment with stuff like that. One thing that you said, Lloyd, and every time you talk about gaming, I always think about how I want to get more into that, and that's our next step. Because whenever, so we introduced retrieval practice 2017. And one of the things, and we talk about this lots, I didn't want to overstretch teachers. So essentially for 4 years, those opportunities have been as close to no stakes rather than low stakes, because the scoring doesn't necessarily lend itself to, I would need to take something out of the workload expectations if I wanted teachers to be keeping a scorebook. And it's only really now after 4 years that we're in the position where actually let's make things a little bit more closer to low stakes. And so we're thinking about pupils trying to beat themselves and how we can set it up in such a way that it's not a burden to the teacher to record this, but each pupil knows how they've done in comparison with themselves in the past. Because I think, certainly when you do assessments outside of the end of Key Stage 2 and the end of Key Stage 4, I think you're always going to have, certainly in my experience, a group of children who just aren't that fussed, and giving them a reason to be fussed, by this low stakes, beat yourself, competing with yourself mode, I think is our next step. But, like we always say, we don't change things overnight. And certainly this is something that as I go into year 5, we're really just thinking about. Because if I look at the studies with confidence with multiple choice questions and the dots that they've got, and you've got -10 at the two extremes, and then like you say, you go towards 1, so you've got, which allows you for that strategy of choosing somewhere in the middle, hedging your bets. It's how do we get that so the teachers can record those scores, can engage with that gamification, so to speak, but without having mark books coming out of their eyeballs. And I know that people have used mark books really, really effectively in the past. I remember listening to Bruno Reddy talking on Craig Barton's podcast years ago, and one of the things they did was they had this record, but I haven't managed to, I think people needed to see the benefit of retrieval first before I made wholesale changes to everything. And so going into year 5, it's only now that my focus is going to be on, well, how can we make this low enough stakes that pupils are engaged? So that it just came to mind as you were sort of talking there, Lloyd.
I like the discussion of competition there, because I know to a lot of teachers, and for a lot of good reasons, the idea of competition in the classroom is anathema. And I know there are certain children who really struggle with what we usually mean by competition. But I think it's worth noting that, and building on what you were saying there, Kieran, that competition with yourself is a whole different business in terms of ego management. Allowing children to say, oh, this was your score yesterday, or this is how you did on this. I wonder how this is progressing over a longer period of time. And then being able to see that progress is a completely different pressure to how have you done on this compared to your peers, which is, yeah, it can be really, really destructive at points.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one. It's a really interesting one. And I've probably been doing tweaking, working at that for about 2 years now, like in the class on the ground. And it's kind of evolved as I've gone in terms of how I've seen children react to it. And I think it's a really like nuanced and quite complex, intricate thing actually when you start getting really into it, and like about how you make it work so that, like, for starters, children can record properly. I mean, the way I was doing it in terms of like you said, so like the triangle sets it up, you know, take negative, taking away 10, taking away whatever. Well, actually, my children are dealing with negative numbers on a daily basis then, because do you know what I mean? Where they've scored like they got 2 wrong and they're taking it away, and they've gone into the negative scale. Like, so they then go to me, how do I do this? You know, so I've had to really think about like how I support them with that, like in terms of like, so it's not just cut and dry. Here's the game system. There's a lot of practicalities to consider when you're doing it, and I think that it's one that needs to, like, careful consideration. But I don't think I wouldn't do it because it's complicated. I think that it's worth a pursuit. That's my again, anecdotally, in my experiences, it's worth a pursuit because I've seen gains from it, and I've seen in my setting with my children them really engage with it, and I've seen that process, you know, as they've moved through working with it. For me, next is now how we sort of use the weighting more rather than just the rating. So in the paper, the Bjork and Spark paper, they talk about this importance of keeping the structure the same and not jumping between different representations as being a strength of retrieval. And also, one of the things I picked out of there, which I thought was quite interesting, is if I'm right, and how I've interpreted this, was that the framing of the question. So when it was re-queued, so when they initially framed the correct answer, that later down the line, that correct answer was then an incorrect answer in the re-queue. I think that's quite an interesting thing that I would like to explore with it, and that actually prompted better retrieval, better recall when it was flipped, and then the answer became not. Now, I might be treading into the next question potentially here, but and how best we deploy them. But I think that's fascinating for me.
Yeah, that's definitely one I've got marked down for how do we get the most out of them. So it probably makes sense to jump into that zone now, you know, because I think the only thing I would add to why are they good is they provide teachers with a structure upon which to base their question design. You know, because if I'm thinking about, well, what do I want my new teachers thinking about? I want them thinking about common misconceptions. I want them thinking about the mathematics that they expect the pupils to know. And I want them to be thinking about how can we leverage this in such a way that we're getting the most, you know, from what we know about, he says, cognitive science. And so in terms of benefits, you know, not just for pupils, I think new teachers in particular find it really easy to engage with something that is so well defined. And so they can practice these behaviors, you know, like I said, 1 question a day. So 5 questions during their PPA session. They're thinking about the things that I think are important, you know, certainly in this aspect of mathematics. You know, it doesn't cover everything, but so I think, you know, why are they good? They allow teachers a framework within which to operate. And, you know, I think we get security from that kind of framework. Certainly I like it whenever I know exactly what's expected of me and what I'm doing next. But there are a few things that we've mentioned in terms of how do we get the most out of them that you know, there are links that I've been sort of holding on to, because you've just said there, Lloyd, you know, using incorrect answers as correct answers in the future. That is absolutely something, you know, there's a video that I've done on YouTube, and I'll link that in this. And I think I took one of the questions from the paper. It was about what's the oldest geyser in, is it Jellystone Park, Yellowstone Park.
Jellystone is the Yogi Bear one, so please say Jellystone.
Yeah, we should go with Jellystone.
And then I switched it around so that it was the tallest. So you had one question asking about the oldest and one question asking about the tallest. And then I did some examples with them, area and perimeter, because pupils will quite often confuse the two. So what is the perimeter of this shape? The area was one of the possible answers. And then the next question, what is the area of this shape? And so you've got the pupils thinking about, well, what is it that's wrong here? And having thought about it, maybe 2 weeks earlier, why is this incorrect? They can then use that to help them work out why that it is correct in the future. So I think definitely using those connections, and that's only when you've got time to think about this with more experienced colleagues. Do you get this kind of thought process possible? The study, Neil, you've mentioned a few times, the one where they talked about how many people actually used the strategy. I think they had another doctor and surgeon situation where even when they were told about the strategy, most of them didn't change what they were doing. And so the first thing I told my teachers at the start of this year was, we need to model this process with our pupils so they know that they're looking out for errors and common misconceptions. And that's how you get to the stage where you have pupils coming to you and talking to you about the things that they've noticed, the reasons why teachers have asked questions. Because if we leave it to chance, that study would suggest that people are going to lack the self-awareness that we find we normally lack, and not really thinking about our problem solving in the way that we hope people will. So I think clear modeling of what's expected from these questions, it's not about getting the question right, is one way to make sure we get the most out of these, because I don't think we naturally develop this ability, to see the deep structure, to see why questions have been posed by default, so I think those are the two things I think about when I'm talking about getting the most out of them. But on a practical level, we have maybe, depending on the school, somewhere between 10 and 5 retrieval questions a day. Sometimes in year one, they've got 3, so in September to December, they'll probably have 3 questions, and then they'll build up as they go through school towards increasingly greater number, whatever is within a realistic capacity for the time frame you give it. And normally one of those questions will be a confidence weighted multiple choice question. And so every day they've got at least one opportunity to think about why things might not be correct, why pupils might overgeneralize. And so that would be my advice, is to do it regularly, to think about what we're trying to get out of the confidence weighted multiple choice question, and then to get better at writing them over time.
Would I be right in thinking that this is something that, while you've used it in mathematics, you'd consider it as a really valuable strategy, or a potentially valuable strategy outside of mathematics, so across the rest of the curriculum?
In term 5 this year, so 6 months after we introduced them, we actually introduced them in maths. We actually brought them into the foundation subjects. And I think, for instance, definitely grammar. There are instances where this kind of question will lend itself. If you're thinking about the nuances of when a comma is appropriate, or when a certain type of punctuation is appropriate, I think there are a lot of similarities with mathematics. But we looked at some of the activities in Kate Jones's retrieval practice. So we were looking at, well, how can we get in retrieval practice 2, and how can we get the sort of the gains that we've been experiencing in mathematics across the wider curriculum. And part of that was looking at, well, how can we use confidence weighted multiple choice questions as well. And so the school, having trusted me in September, after about a year of reading and me talking about, well, this is where I want to go to next, we did about 6 months of trial. Teachers love it. It wasn't one of those things where you have to make sure they were still happening. This stuff was happening by default, and I think that's because they enjoyed the framework that it provided. And then for the last 2 terms, or the last 2 small terms, we have extended it across curriculum. So I think you're absolutely right, Chris, because I think there are certain things it's worth remembering, and if we choose those things, then that makes history or science or geography much more easily accessed because key pieces of knowledge are in place.
Obviously, there are a lot of parallels here with hinge questions. There are, like, because I would say a hinge question can sit in the confidence weighted model. Like, for me, that's what it is. I pick up those wicked hinge questions and sit them in where they fit into this model. Because, so if we apply all that wonderful stuff from Harry Fletcher Wood, and then apply this kind of mechanic, you're onto something there. I think you are, anyway, personally. You know, to quote Harry Fletcher Wood, he said that the hinge questions should unambiguously reveal student thinking. And I think that is a really important point, isn't it? It's about revealing thinking. And so when we view it through a lens of history, say, then this is a lovely way, isn't it, for discussion in those subjects. You know, we talk about how best to deliver and to design tasks and to design lessons in foundation, in history and geography and things. And I hear teachers, I'm sure others may hear the same sort of issues, particularly with the sort of focus on knowledge, that, well, we just talk at them. What am I supposed to do? I just talk at them. But, you know, how am I supposed to design? That you can get into these territories. Well, actually, with a really beautifully crafted hinge question that's sitting inside a weighted sort of confidence multiple choice, that's a beautiful way to start unpacking that, isn't it? It's a beautiful structure to do that. Take, for example, I'm now pinching a Harry Fletcher Wood example, and I'm going to sit it on that. So, you know, look at it, say you're studying the Industrial Revolution, or, you know, you can have it in picture format. You know, 3 pictures. Which one of these pictures best represents a building from the Industrial Revolution? Right, like, and bang, you're in then for a conversational, a dialogic approach. Yet you can smack down those, get that toxic sign warning going, and knock down those misconceptions, but also address things and really, you know, hit the point on the head. Yet the children are very much involved in that process, rather than it being here is a building from this period, if you see what I mean. And also, whilst doing that, you're assessing what they already know. So I think that's another point I just wanted to make before I hand over, is that as much as they are retrieval, they don't always have to be retrieval. They're very, very versatile tool. It's a very versatile tool. It can come as a part of checking for understanding right at the very beginning, because we know there's going to be children sat there who will know straight away which building is from the Industrial Revolution, because they've talked about it on the dinner table at home. And there's going to be those that don't. So, like, it's establishing, and there may be some surprises there as well, isn't there? You know, some things that reveal that you think, because we don't know their knowledge in the same way that we know their maths and their English, then it's a really useful tool to do that.
So you've talked about the value of them in terms of assessment and in terms of embedding understanding, addressing misconceptions, etc. I guess my follow-up question personally on this is, and it's linked, of course, is what are the limits of it? Are there circumstances where you think this isn't quite going to work? A confidence-weighted multiple choice question, or maybe not a multiple choice question at all, is just not suitable for this bit of assessment or for this bit of checking for misconceptions. What are the limits of it, do you think?
So I made a list of the areas I think lend themselves most in mathematics. And I can't remember off the top of my head exactly, but certain ones fit the criteria. For instance, the incorrect answer being used again. So maybe I'll screen grab that list, because it's in that video on YouTube. So I think it's about professional judgment then, and knowing the content, and not, just like anything, not trying to shoehorn question formats or question structures in just because we can. You know, your point, Lloyd, on the assessment, I think is really important. And just because we place it in that part of the lesson, sometimes they can be preemptive assessment questions that will give a teacher an idea. So I think that's, you know, I'm almost assuming too much knowledge. You know, the question that comes to mind in terms of how revealing a question can be is, and I don't know if it's Daisy Christodoulou or Harry Fletcher Wood, but it's the one about the difference between the dictatorships of Stalin and Hitler. And, you've got three pretty gruesome similarities. And then the difference is the privatization of land. And that tells you so much about what that student understands about that period in history. And it shows you how powerful these kinds of questions can be. So I think they take a lot of thought. And as you say, Chris, one of the things we need to dedicate our thoughts to is which areas of the curriculum lend themselves best. Because it's not going to be everything. I think certain things lend themselves much more easily.
Yeah, I think I would definitely agree with everything that's been said there. I think one way that you could maybe then take it perhaps one step further, and this doesn't quite answer your question, Chris, about its limitations, but is just getting them to explain why the other answers were wrong. And I think that, so just thinking about what you said there, Kieran, about I think it's Daisy Christodoulou, that example with the dictators, where you think they might be exceptionally useful is perhaps in those situations in which you might have called higher order thinking, thinking about, I'm sure we've all lived through some like Bloom's taxonomy and accelerating progress going up the Bloom ladder. But I think, one way that you can add just that extra level of challenge into those lessons quite easily is actually, explain why that Hitler was a member of the Nazi Party and he wasn't a member of the Socialist Party. He wasn't a member of the a centrist German party, for example, and just getting children to think harder about that could help. So I think perhaps then to answer your question there, where, Chris, is that they might actually be better if that is the kind of question or that's the kind of conversation that you might then naturally have as a result of the information that the teacher's receiving back, depending on what the answers are. Whereas they may be less useful for things like 7 times 3 and that kind of quick factual knowledge that you really just want children to have.
Yeah, it does. I think that makes a lot of sense. There's almost like a middle ground between the hyper-specific, there's a right answer and there are some wrong answers, and there isn't really a good distractor for what's 7 multiplied by 6. It's 42, and you could make an argument that, I often see children saying that that's 48, but there isn't really good distractors for that, and so perhaps that's not something you'd want it almost certainly isn't something you'd want for a multiple choice question of any sort. And then I guess there's the other end of the spectrum where, and again, I'm spitballing here because I've not used confidence weighted multiple choice questions in the classroom myself, but I imagine there's another end of the spectrum where you're talking about things that have a wider array of answers, or perhaps can only really be answered through something that's either a longer form of answer, or something maybe even that's contextual and opinionated, rather than something that has kind of quite precise answers. I guess it only obviously works with something that has a quite clear, relatively brief, correct answer and a decent set of distractors.
I think it's also one of the other limitations to consider is the age at which you roll these out. I think, metacognitively speaking, it's quite it's quite challenging, I would say, in terms of like being able to explain and describe why things aren't right and wrong. For me, it's quite advanced thinking. It is that higher order stuff, like Neil described, definitely. So I don't know what art Kieran, you might be able to feed into this. I've only done this with my small groups. Haven't had whole school rollout. You've had whole school rollout on this. I don't know what, if I was going to perceive there to be limitations, that could be one for me, that is when like the best time in their development across the primary phase to start to roll these out. I don't know what to...
Earliest that I've had conversations on that metacognitive level are pupils in year 3. I've seen pupils in year 2 engage with them really well, and as this conversation is opened, I'm almost coming to the idea that there might be a 2-tier system. Because we talked a lot about misconceptions and thinking about why things are wrong, and then we've gone on to talk about that next tier, where we are revealing sort of deep understanding. And so I think it then comes down to the teacher thinking about, well, what is it I want to achieve? Because if you've got year one, let's say post-Christmas, and once or twice a week, once or twice a month, you are introducing them to a format, and that's what you want to get out of it. You want them to be aware that there are potential reasons for answers being selected. I don't think that's beyond the boundaries of what we can reasonably expect. So I think it comes down to what the school wants to be taking place. And I think, the maturity in Key Stage 2 lends itself to the kind of deep thought that we really want to gain from this, and the deep understanding of pupil understanding. So even just taking part in this conversation has really helped shape my thoughts on this, because like I say, we've been using this as a tool as a school for an academic year, and so that will continue to develop as we move into the next one, and over time, we'll try and make it better and more efficient. So I think it's been really useful, definitely, to chat it through.
I love that idea of the familiarity with it, with the structures being bred early, so that feels like, oh yeah, I know this thing, we've done this, and oh, here's a new twist on. It's building that familiarity, isn't it? I think that's just a really smart thing, and I'm taking that from this. That's going in my back pocket.
That reminds me of that idea of having a set structure and then saying, we're going to use this for lots of different things, because it would, it allows children to not have to worry about the structure of the task, or the structure of in this case, the way of questioning. It reminds me of what Gareth Metcalf talks about with, I think it was on the episode 7 of series 2, where he was talking about different ways of structuring reasoning tasks, and having a set structure that a few of them that you use across school quite consistently and competently means that the students are familiar with them. It reduces some of the difficulties of actually using them on a day-to-day basis, and allows them to focus on the mathematics. And I guess this just ties into that as well.
So I think all that's really left to consider is, where do we go if we want to learn more? So on the Discord, I put 2 papers that I think everybody should start with. And obviously, if anyone's got any more, throw them in. Andrew Woods does a really good introduction. I think it was at Red Surrey Online last year. I'll share a link for that. I then tried to take it on to the next step and look at what implementation is like in the classroom. I'll share that link. Is there anything else you guys would point listeners to in terms of learning more about confidence-weighted multiple choice questions?
They are mentioned briefly in Mark McCourt's Teaching for Mastery. So if you happen to have a copy of that lying around, and you should do for other reasons, there is a small section dedicated to multiple choice questions in there. And I also believe, I think the first place I actually heard them from was with Craig Barton's first interview with the Bjorks, I believe. And so again, if it's the first time that you listen to that podcast, you'll walk away with far more important things to come away from it than just this concept of confidence-weighted multiple choice, but certainly that's another source. Oddly enough, TES have a good few examples. If you wanted a template, we wanted to see what they might look like in maths. If you typed in confidence-weighted multiple choice onto the TES resource section, there's a few elements that come up there as well. So definitely worth checking out.
I would add Craig Barton's interview with Colin Foster. They go into it actually in quite a bit, and to talk about hypercorrection. They talk about confidence ratings and things, and he explains a little bit of the project that he did around that, because I know, and I'm sure if that hasn't been linked, that Colin Foster's work itself on confidence ratings in mathematics and things, he's done a whole load of work. So just check out some of his stuff.
It's been fascinating as always. Thank you very much for being here, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.